The Garden of Persistence. The morning sun cast long shadows across Sarah's backyard, painting the neglected garden in shades of gold and amber. She stood at the kitchen window, coffee mug warming her hands, watching the weeds dance gently in the spring breeze. The garden had been her grandmother's pride and joy once. Now it lay dormant, waiting. Sarah had inherited the house 6 months ago, along with all the dreams and responsibilities that came with it. At 28, she thought she had life figured out: a steady job at the marketing firm, a reliable car, and now a house with good bones and endless possibilities. But standing there in the quiet morning light, she felt the weight of uncertainty pressing against her chest. The garden stretched before her like an unfinished poem. Weeds had claimed most of the space where her grandmother's prized tomatoes once grew. The wooden fence leaned at odd angles, and the small greenhouse in the corner had several broken panes that caught the light like fractured mirrors. It looked impossible to restore. Sarah had never gardened before. Her apartment life had consisted of a single succulent that somehow managed to thrive despite her neglect. But something about this space called to her, whispered promises of growth and renewal that she couldn't quite ignore. She stepped outside, her bare feet touching the cool grass. The morning air carried the scent of damp earth and possibility. Walking slowly through the overgrown paths, she began to notice details that had escaped her before. A stubborn rosebush pushed through the weeds, its thorny branches reaching toward the sun. Purple wildflowers had claimed a corner near the fence, creating an unexpected splash of color. The problem seemed overwhelming at first glance. The soil looked hard and unforgiving. Tools rusted in the small shed. The irrigation system had long since failed. Sarah knelt down and ran her fingers through the earth, feeling its dry, compacted texture. Doubt crept in like morning fog. Maybe I should just hire someone, she murmured to herself, brushing dirt from her hands. But as she stood to leave, something caught her eye. Near the base of an old apple tree, she spotted a small green shoot pushing through the hard ground. She knelt again, clearing away the debris around it. It was a sunflower seedling, impossibly small and delicate, yet determined enough to break through the challenging soil. Sarah found herself returning to the garden every morning. She started small, clearing just 1 square foot of weeds each day. Her hands grew calloused, and her back ached from the unfamiliar work. Some days, the progress felt invisible. The weeds seemed to grow back overnight, and the soil remained stubborn and uncooperative. Weeks passed. Sarah's initial enthusiasm began to waver. The garden still looked more like a wilderness than the productive space she had envisioned. Her friend suggested she give up, focus on the house interior instead. Even her mother gently hinted that perhaps gardening wasn't her calling. One particularly difficult afternoon, after a full day of removing rocks and roots from a small patch near the greenhouse, Sarah sat on the old wooden bench and let frustration wash over her. The physical work was harder than she had expected. The learning curve felt impossibly steep. Every small victory seemed followed by 2 new challenges. But then she noticed the sunflower. The tiny seedling she had discovered weeks ago now stood nearly a foot tall, its broad leaves reaching confidently toward the sky. Despite the poor soil, despite the competition from weeds, despite every obstacle in its path, it had continued growing. Sarah studied the young plant with new eyes. She realized that growth hadn't been about the dramatic transformation she had imagined. It had been happening in small, daily increments that were nearly invisible until she stepped back to see the bigger picture. This revelation changed everything. She began to approach the garden differently. Instead of focusing on the overwhelming scope of the entire project, she celebrated each small improvement. A patch of cleared earth, a repaired section of fence, the first tomato plant successfully transplanted. The work became meditative rather than frustrating. Sarah found herself looking forward to the quiet morning hours in the garden, when the world felt peaceful and full of potential. She learned to read the subtle signs of the earth, to understand when plants needed water or space, or simply time. Months passed like pages turning in a favorite book. By midsummer, the transformation was remarkable, not because the garden had become perfect, but because it had become alive. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines. The repaired greenhouse sheltered delicate herbs that filled the air with fragrance. The sunflower, now taller than Sarah herself, turned its golden face toward the sun each day like a compass pointing toward hope. Sarah's friends began visiting, drawn by the beauty and tranquility of the space. But more than that, they noticed a change in Sarah herself. She moved with a confidence that hadn't been there before, spoke with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned to trust in gradual progress. One evening, as golden hour light filtered through the apple trees' leaves, Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stopped by the fence. "Your grandmother would be so proud," the older woman said softly. "She always said this garden had magic in it, but it only worked for people willing to be patient with the process." Sarah smiled, understanding finally what her grandmother had known all along. The garden had never been about the vegetables or flowers. It had been about learning that growth requires time, that problems are often opportunities in disguise, and that the most meaningful transformations happen slowly. almost imperceptibly, like sunflowers pushing through hard ground. As the sun set behind the mountains, Sarah stood among her plants, surrounded by the gentle evening sounds of a garden in full bloom. The problems that had once seemed impossible were still there in different forms. But now she knew something she hadn't known before. Every challenge was simply another opportunity to grow. The sunflower nodded in the evening breeze, as if it had always known this truth, and had been waiting patiently for Sarah to discover it too.